So now that I remember to actually hit the button, I asked you to tell me a couple structures we left off talking about. I was indeed looking for the cuticle and the stomata. Okay, the cuticle, that outer layer, and then the stomata, the openings for gas exchange in plants. Well, today we're going to kind of move on in plant evolution, past those early, not bryophytes. What's wrong with me? We talked about them yesterday. Why can't I remember? Starts with a C. Somebody help me out. Charophytes. I couldn't remember the word. I had to actually go back in the presentation to remember it. I am recording, yes. It didn't sound good. You're right, and that's okay. I can make mistakes. You can too. It's fine. Unless you're like reffing my daughter's swim meet, and then you're not allowed. Oh, I did get that on, 2 recordings. Ryan Milks, I do need to address one thing with you. You need to go on and share you gave the wrong link to Mr. Urich. So if you'll hop next door real quick and fix that with him, I'd appreciate it, and then come back. Yes, please. Okay? I'm glad you caused a disruption, so I remember to do that. All right, so early bryophytes. These are non-vascular plants, which means they don't have all of that xylem and phloem tissue we're talking about. That's not yet. So they lack specialized means of transporting water and organic nutrients. They're sort of at one with their environment, very similar to algae. They do not have true roots, stems, and leaves, and the gametophyte is a dominant generation. So that means that they're mainly that gameto, or the gamete stage. They produce eggs in archegonia, which I'll show you a flow chart in a minute. They produce flagellated sperm in antheridia. You guys probably think of antheridium when you hear that word, or not. The sperm swim to egg in a film of water. So water is essential here. And if you think about the early evolution of plants, we're kind of talking about going from an extremely aquatic environment into the land environment. So there would have had to been able to be a lot of moisture in these early environments. Has anybody ever been in the woods and seen that thing that looks kind of like a moss, but has like almost a leafy, flaky structure, but is not quite lichen? I don't know how much time you guys spend out in the woods. I'll show you a picture of one, but what? Yeah, you'll recognize. You'll be like, oh. But here we're talking about things like liverworts, and I know that's why I had to kind of describe what it is in order for you to understand. I'll show you a picture of one. But these have either flattened thallus or a leafy appearance. So it almost looks like this leaf that's been flattened on the ground. But then you look closer and you're like, gosh, it's kind of like a moss, but not really. And that's what we're talking about here. Now, some contain what are called rhizoids, which are almost like a root in a way. In fact, there's very special structures on legume roots called rhizoids, which we'll talk about later. But these anchor the plant in soil, and they do aid in the absorption of water, because water, of course, is needed for all plants. And if you're not directly in an aquatic environment, you have to have a way to bring in water. So it is arguably the early ancestors, or the early evolutionary structure of a root is a rhizoid. So they can reproduce either sexually or asexually, which means they have the ability to either self-replicate or take in genetics of another organism. And then there are the hornworts. These have small sporophytes that carry on photosynthesis. Sporophyte. We know what a sporophyte is. That's like a tree, right? So these are going to have a larger structure that can actually draw in glucose. And they'll live in moist, well-shaded areas. Mostly the shade is there to retain moisture so it doesn't evaporate as part of the water cycle. They are photosynthetic, and their symbiotic relationship with cyanobacteria allow nitrogen fixation from the air. Now, a lot of corals have a symbiote too. What's a symbiote? A symbiote would be like me taking in another organism, and I know you understand symbiosis, but some organisms to this date aren't born with like mitochondria like we are. They have to actually have a symbiote infect them, come into their cell, and then bring it in after they're made. So a lot of corals are all these different pretty colors because of their symbiotes. How many of you have heard of coral bleaching? Maybe it mentioned. This is what happens when coral actually, Joe, spit out their symbiote. So if I spit out my symbiote that is full of pigments collecting light for me, what the absence of light is white, right, in that case, so you're just going to reflect white light. And so when that happens, it's called the bleaching of coral. So I want you to think of these hornworts in a very similar way, where they bring in cyanobacteria who are living in them and giving them their green color, but it's not them with their own chloroplast, if that makes sense. Okay. And then there's mosses, and we're all familiar with moss. They're the largest phyla of non-vascular plants. There's 3 distinct groupings of mosses. There's peat, granite, and true mosses. They usually have a leafy shoot, although some are secondarily flattened. So usually they're kind of fluffy, kind of like a little chia pet looking thing. But a lot of times they are flat too. The sporophyte is always attached at the gametophyte. So that means that at the junction where that the structure grows out of is the actual gametophyte. We'll look at that in a minute. I spent a month on the Appalachian Trail, and I saw more different types of mosses on that trip than I care to admit, but it was pretty cool. If you picked every green on the planet, I think you could see it in a moss forest. Has anybody ever seen a moss forest? Like a true moss forest? No? Well, shoot. So this is hornwort. We talked about the sporophyte growing directly out of the gametophyte, and that's why I said it's almost like a flattened leaf on the ground, but not quite. You would look at it and say, oh, it kind of looks like moss, but it's kind of slimy and leaf-like on the bottom. That doesn't look right. So this is the gametophyte structure. This is that sporophyte structure. And then we talked about moss. We're going to go through the life cycle of a moss. Now, moss can be male and female. Okay? The gametophyte is going to be the top structure, the portion you're looking at. Okay? And the rhizoids on the bottom help draw in moisture. This is why moss live in very moist, wet areas and need to be shaded. Otherwise, they lose all their moisture, and the rhizoids don't have enough. Because rhizoids do not go very deep. Usually, they're on the dead, decaying matter right at the surface. So what happens then is we produce what's called an antheridia, and then the female version is the archegonia. Now, the antheridia can release a spore-like structure. Keep moving here. That we will refer to as sperm, not necessarily a spore now, not quite pollen. We're not talking about flowering plants. We will be tomorrow, but not today. And of course, there is an egg, and it's kind of weird because we're going to be dissecting plants, and you guys are going to be finding the ovaries and the eggs and the pollen, the sperm, all the sexual organs of a plant tomorrow. And then the sperm is actually flagellated. So if it's flagellated, what will it need? What does the flagella require to work? Guys are all like, what are you talking about, Mr. Mason? And I say, yes, exactly. Water, right? Yay, water. You can't swim without water, right? No. Keep thinking of that. Every time I say swim, I think of that ref yesterday. I could have pushed him in the pool. If I was down there, I would have. I know. Ever tell you about the time I pushed Mr. Urich in the pool? He had his cell phone in. That was funny. Except I had to buy him a new phone. He walked into, it was at the end of the day, and he walked into the swim practice to talk to, I think it was Mr. B. This was like 8 years ago. And I just saw him there, and I was like, oh, that's too easy. And I walked in and just kicked him. And he went, but he had a cell phone in his pocket. Every time I push someone in a pool, I end up buying them a new cell phone. I did it to Mr. Lull, too. I should have asked, right? Yeah. Yep. So these come together, of course, sperm, in this case egg, come together, we know, to form a zygote. Anytime you hear sperm and egg, go directly to zygote afterwards. Fertilization is going to be part of this process. And, of course, this is one of the very first times where we actually see sperm swimming to egg, which is very unique as far as the evolution of plants. Okay? Eventually, this is going to develop. Now, this will start to develop into that sporophyte. And I got to blow up my screen. Can you guys see that on your screen, I hope? Okay. And at the end, you're going to form various structures, a capsule and a sporangium. Now, the sporangium is going to receive, the capsule is going to release. So the mature sporophyte has food buried in a female gametophyte tissue, a stalk and an upper capsule, the sporangium, okay? And you can see there's a receiving end here where meiosis occurs and spores are produced. So after these spores are made, of course, they get released, and then wind and water do their thing and disperse them throughout the planet or the environment, okay? And the operculum here is going to actually detach and release, and there are actually teeth that hold it in place. Once that falls off, then those can be released. Keep looking for that, and I've got the screen blowing up. Okay. Once the teeth release, the spores are released, and the spores disperse. And when they're most likely to disperse by air currents, we understand that. Spores usually dry out. A lot of times mosses, you'll see these little filament-looking structures on the top of the green. Has anybody ever seen moss and been like, oh, there's a little yellow stuff there on top? Have you guys noticed this or no? We were supposed to take a nature walk today. It didn't happen, but we'll see if it's still raining. What? No? Well, we'll see if it's raining here in a minute. I wanted to cover megaspores, microspores, sporophytes, and some of the mosses today, because you can find this stuff anywhere. And maybe some bryophytes if we're lucky. Okay? So then our spores actually do something unique. They start to divide through mitosis. Must have left my phone on. Sorry. We'll let the machine will pick it up. Let me make sure it's not emergent, though. It's in my pocket. So you guys got me on video with my phone in class going off. I have no clue who you are. It's not my family. What? What happened? It probably was. Probably called to apologize, right? Probably not. All right, so the immature gametophyte is where a spore germinates into a male or female protonema. The first stage of the male and the female gametophyte. Okay, so this will actually form a bud, branch off, and then grow into different male and female plants. It's almost like, well, it is like, the male gamete or spore is going to grow into its own structure, as is the female. So this is the first time where we're starting to see these separate male and female organisms, and it is, probably means I got a message, right? I wonder, that wasn't a very long apology. Now I'm going to stop here because I do want to go over your lab tomorrow, because I want to come in tomorrow ready to go, because we're going to have a bunch of flowers, and I don't think they're going to keep very well over the weekend, although I will put them in the fridge just in case.